Now, I would very quickly tell anybody who hasn't already figured this out that I'm not an expert on Kilkenny as such, despite the kind comments. And I feel not quite a charlatan, but certainly somebody who is perhaps imposing myself a little bit on people who know a great deal more about this city than I do. But my claim is that I really have at different points in my time doing history engaged with Kilkenny. And it sort of goes back to a conversation in a corridor in UCD about 1988 when a Wexford man and a Tipperary man, Kevin Whelan and Willie Nolan, said, would you do something on the 18th century for our Kilkenny volume? And I said, why me? He said, well, you know about Cork and you know about Dublin, and you could sort of see how Kilkenny's 18th century story sort of fits into Dublin and Cork. And I was a bit, not entirely persuaded, but let's say I left and said I would. And the chapter that I was referring to was the outcome. And I really enjoyed spending a summer really getting to know Kilkenny. And that's a very long time ago now. But one that, in a sense, forced me to think about not just Dublin and Cork and Kilkenny, but about, if you like, the development of 18th century Irish big towns, Irish cities. It was something that, in a sense, was on the back burner while I was involved in many other things in subsequent years, working on Dublin, working on Cork, working on 1798 and a dozen other things. But when I had the time and the leisure, as I now have, I was persuaded to do this sort of study of the top 10 Irish places and to really think about why you have this period of extraordinary urban growth in the 1700s. And of course, Kilkenny fitted into this kind of returned comparative history, because apart from anything else, anybody like me coming to look at Kilkenny comes with a tremendous advantage because of all the work that's been done over the centuries. Carrigan, even further back, Tye, Graves, all the way down to modern times, and John Bradley, Neely, and all the work that's gone into the Society's journal over the last, 60, 70, 80, 70 something years. I mean, there's a great deal there in the secondary literature for anybody who's trying to sort of get a sense, and some real treasures in terms of archives or on things that were transcribed before 1922 and the Record Office fire. So I suppose the reason I'm here tonight is I am trying to sort of just say, well, Kilkenny fits into a bigger story. The bigger story is what I try to do in this book. And some of what I'm going to say in the first half this evening is that bigger story, and then kind of come back thinking much more particularly about our own place here. But just to begin, if this is working okay, really with, if you like, the kind of basic starting point was looking at the cities that if you take the first Irish census, I know you can't read the figures back and take my word for it, even just look at the way that the columns are swelling in size. Essentially, looking at the first national census of Ireland in 1821, the cities that are, or the places that are recorded as having more than a population of 10,000 were kind of caught in my lens. And to compare that, go back to the very problematic so-called poll tax census done at the very end of the Cromwellian period, just on the cusp of the Restoration. And the figures here are estimated civilian populations. So you have for Kilkenny something under 4,000 and a population in 1821 of somewhere around 23,000. So there's, in some cases, a sevenfold, an eightfold, a tenfold growth consistently across the board. So it's that very basic, perhaps you might say rather crude, population measure that justifies, I hope, the notion of a transformation. Now, I very quickly said these figures can be attacked. I mean, the 1660 figure is based on a set of assumptions. You might say it's very soft ice. 1821 has its problems too. The ice, though, is a bit harder. But the transformation isn't just these numbers. You only have to look at evidence of the maps, evidence of directories, all sorts of other kinds of things that show you the scale, the kind of the economic character, the composition of these places changed utterly over that that century and a half. They are, if you like, they move from being much more intimate and to some extent more military to being much more about, if you like, secular business. They are more culturally mixed, or that carries all sorts of issues. And this is an important point, if you look at the 1660 figures and you go back to look at the source, you see that it's divided between quote-unquote English and quote-unquote Irish residents at that moment, at the end of the Cromwellian period. And certainly any of these places, even Galway, although that hardly applies there, if you could look at where did the people come from, certainly there is the mix of those who've come from within Ireland and those who've come from England, from Holland, or a little later in the 17th century from France. In other words, you have a much kind of more mixed migration field, and you look back in these at that snapshot in 1650, whereas if you fast forward to 1821, the second column, and if we had full figures on where did the people come from who weren't actually born in the cities, we can be pretty confident that they are Irish migrants for the most part. And we actually know, go forward rather 20 more years to the 1841 census, when you do have information in the printed census of the birthplaces by county of the residents of each city. So we're moving to, however religiously mixed, however culturally different the makeup of a place like Dublin may have been in 1821, it is very much a city made up then of persons of Irish birth. Well, let me just take another image from another city. This is a view of Cork by Thomas Soutell Roberts from about 1792. There's some issues with the dates, 1790s. Now, I'm putting it up because not just because it's a reasonably pretty little picture, but because it's looking down on a city that is new. Everything there is of the 18th century. It's all the urban area that you see from the right-hand side is on, or almost all, is on land that had been reclaimed since the 1680s. You see the church spires, I think, I'm not sure, but I think this is the Church of Ireland reconstructed cathedral from the 1730s and 40s, not the St. Finbarrs of the 19th century, but the 18th century cathedral, new, I don't need to tell you what you're looking at there. You've got a bridge that has just been built, the lower bridge on the side of what is now Patrick's Bridge, and you have this great wall, this navigation wall going out down the Lee. Now, I'm just making the point that everything there, or almost everything that the artist is capturing, is down from the old walled city of Cork, that in a sense the expansion had taken place from the mid-1600s. And there, in the image at the end of the 18th century, you're looking at the result of reclamation, public works, public and private building. Now, there's no grand plan behind what's happening there in Cork or in most of the other cities. It's really the result of myriad little speculations with relatively light touch regulation by the town government, by the city government, by the Corporation of Cork. Now, thanks to the work of the Historic Towns Atlas, which is nearly completed now after 40 years. You obviously have the Kilkenny one with John Bradley, done many years ago. You can sort of look at this sort of spatial transformation of individual towns and cities much better than we could do 30 plus years ago. So it's what I'm saying there for Cork. And incidentally, Cork is one of the atlases that hasn't yet been done. It's underway at the moment, I think. But the thing is, this sort of story of the newness, the taking in of land, the bursting out from the walls, the gathering and the development, the layout of new streets is now much more easy to study, in all the areas that have been covered by the great Historic Towns Atlas series. The most recent one is, I think, is it Drogheda or Galway, and the series rolls on, and it's extraordinarily valuable as a kind of research tool. So what were the underlying drivers of all this growth? Well, you might say, despite everything, peace. Ireland, between certainly the 1690s and the 1790s, enjoyed internal peace, perhaps cold peace, but peace nonetheless, at a time when maritime trade, agricultural exports, linen exports from the 1660s grew quite, taking a long run, grew very impressively. And you have an era of not just trade growth, but when inland you have kind of regional specialization, a degree of integration through the development of cattle fairs, road systems, credit arrangements operating largely from the port town. So it's a very different sort of Ireland in the 1790s from the 1660s. In many senses, you could say it's a colonial economy, but it's a very different kind of economy to that in the era of Cromwell or the Restoration. And that change had come about through the huge development of continental and Atlantic demand for Irish products. You might say the Irish economy was servicing not just one but several empires, and also meeting the kind of protein deficit on the continent. And then towards the end of the 1700s, the increasing demand for Irish food from England itself becomes so important, and coupled with all that, the demand in wartime from the navies of England and France. So in other words, it's a story that stretches over 150 years from the 1650s, the 60s to the 1820s. So this kind of great kind of story of urban growth is linked to what's happening over the horizon. But city growth also reflected, if you like, what's happening inland, the development of an Irish market for goods and services, in other words, for Irish consumers as well. And here, just to give you an image, not of the Dublin Custom House that you know, but of the Custom House that it replaced. This is more or less on the site of Temple Bar. And that bridge there is, you understand, as Essex Street Bridge leading northwards into Cable Street. But I'm putting up that image, which is a sort of mid-18th century image of a almost palatial custom house there that had been built in 1704, 1705. Indeed, they had to put an extra story on before it was fully operational. And why I'm suggesting what was going on there? It was where the revenue commissioners were. It was where the Dublin customs system operated from. It was where goods coming into the country were tariffed. Now, exports were subject to customs duties as well, but the major source of income came from incoming goods, the luxuries, the textiles, the raw materials, and so on. But the point is, Dublin was very much the kind of centre for that growth in both consumable and sort of durable products coming from England and from much further afield in the 18th century. That's telling us something about the country as a whole. Even if you like the growth of something like sugar, the growth of kind of more expensive textiles. And of course, it's coming into a country that, by say the standards of 18th century England, was poorer, a society though that was stratified. In other words, you have much more. You have striking levels of inequality in Ireland, but it's not just a binary of rich landlords and landless small farmers. There is a much more complex society, particularly in the east and the south of the country, and it's the way that more the whole sort of middling order are buying and part of a world that is consuming goods for necessities and fashions, that is giving, among other things, business to the cities and to the towns, and particularly to a place like Dublin. Dublin was very much the national warehouse, the national workshop as well for finishing and high-end consumer goods, benefiting, of course, from some measure of protection, from some level of tariffs, and the very fact of distance from sources. The old days of sale even affected the benefits of those who made things up in Ireland as opposed to importing them from England, which was all to change in the era of the first steamboats in the next century. Dublin was also, of course, the financial centre of the Irish economy, the centre of proto-banking, and the service centre for the well-to-do. In other words, the centre of education, centre of law, and of course, entertainment, very much a seasonal tidal movement that in winter time, the activities of Dublin were very much geared to the high end of society. That was when the law terms were on. That's in every second winter when Parliament was sitting. You could certainly say that some of that business in the Customs House was geared to when seasonal demand was going to be at its strongest. But Dublin was the focus in Leinster and beyond for retail supplies. And one of the things that I want to emphasise here when we're thinking about Dublin's relationship with other Irish places is the way in which a place like Kilkenny developed very strong links with certain types of activity in the capital city. In other words, a focus for people based in many trades in Kilkenny would have been Thomas Street in Dublin, High Street in Dublin, Francis Street in Dublin. In other words, parts that were actually in the old walled city or just outside the walled city. These were the areas where the suppliers of what the country wanted, the medium quality cloth, the raw materials that the glazier and the carpenter and all the rest might seek. If you look at the Dublin directories, which we have every year from the 1750s, you can see this kind of great diversification of trading houses in those areas. And particularly emphasize Francis Street, which we associate with the antique trade, but which, 300 years and 250 years ago was very much a centre for textiles, particularly for woolens and blankets. And much of what was being produced here and hereabouts in Kilkenny was carted up to Dublin to Francis Street, and indeed Francis Street textiles were of a different variety, including imported ones, coming back through the same dealers back to the draper shops here and in many other places. These streets tended to specialise in particular ways. Francis Street, as I say, very much associated with the woolen trades. And roughly half of all the shops, at least the ones that I mentioned in the directory, in Francis Street, were tied in one way or another to the woolen trade or to the fustian trade, the blanket trade, and would have been very familiar to Kilkenny dealers because of that. Now, I could say a lot more about that. I suppose, make a quick footnote about Francis Street. It was also very important, if you like, in the religious history of the capital city, because the acting cathedral was there, St. Francis of Myra, on Francis Street. So it's a street that's never had a good history written about it, but I think there's a fascinating story to tell there. But this emphasis I've given the last few minutes on Dublin shouldn't sort of get away from the point that all bar Kilkenny, all the places I've been looking at were engaged in, to some extent, in two-way foreign trade. Now, economies of scale and specialisation had kind of led to the relative decline of certain ports, and particularly some of the ones that are not in that top 10, places like Wexford or Kinsale or Youghal, that had been important the previous century. But I think the point is that of the 8 ports other than Dublin, you can see them all engaged to some extent in some cases, very specialised overseas trade. But let's begin to narrow the lens and ask about Kilkenny. How did it fit in? How do you have an inland city that's on the same kind of rank as these port cities that had been so much affected by the growth of maritime trade? Well, of course, once upon a time, Kilkenny had been very much a centre of cross-channel trade, or at least you had your merchants, as we have in this building, linked, as Anne has shown in her essays in the past, linked to Bristol in Elizabethan times, if not earlier. But that's only one dimension. I think if it isn't too kind of didactic, I would say that if we ask the question, why was Kilkenny as large as it was, as sort of successful as it was, as a big urban place in the 1700s? I think there are 3 types of answer, and I'm going to sort of just go through them one by one. But the 3, I suppose, to put it, first of all, you could say there is the legacy explanation. Kilkenny in the 18th century was as big as it was because of the past. A second sort of answer would be to say, well, it's all about the hinterland. It's all about the particular, the very specific nature of the county and particularly the areas close to the city. And then the third explanation to say, well, you really can only explain Kilkenny's success, successful term, by saying it's all because of Dublin. So let me just say a little bit about each of those. I mean, they're all sort of relatively familiar points, but I want just to revisit them for a few minutes. The legacy one, the legacy of an unusual level of urbanization in the Ormond lands, especially in the 15th and 16th century, is, self-evident. All work done on sort of late medieval and early modern Ireland sort of notices this, whether you're looking at the whole of the kind of the Three Rivers system from, Clonmel and Cahir across to Carlow. You have a part of the country where the level of urbanization, both medium and larger towns, is unusually strong by Irish standards. It's unique by Irish standards. So it's certainly true to say that there is, from at least the late medieval period, a more advanced, more stratified sort of economic system in the southeast, not exclusively on sort of butler lands, but very much connected with it. And then narrowing it down to Kilkenny itself, you can say you have here that kind of lineage of, 15 burgher families who had a proactive role in trade, in particularly the 16th century, links through New Ross, possibly through Waterford, and taking, in other words, I wanted there. I mean, a very familiar image, of course, produced in the earliest, one of the earliest volumes of the Transactions of the Kilkenny Archaeological Society, but based on a painting from before 1771, when the market cross here was taken down. But I'm just putting up that image because it's we know something about the market crosses in Galway, in Waterford, I think that's all, and Dublin. And the Kilkenny one seems to be a much more sophisticated sort of late medieval sort of marker of the importance of, if I, of a public symbol in the city. So there is you have no difficulty in making the case for the kind of wealth and perhaps you might say the pretensions of the city of Kilkenny, or at that stage it would have been still the town of Kilkenny in late medieval times, and in a way becoming recognised, formally enchartered as a city in 1609, recognises not just the persuasiveness of the butlers, but also the facts on the ground. Then coming a little further forward in time, into the 1600s, I mean, it's also true to say Kilkenny was lucky compared to other Irish towns, including nearly all the ports apart from Dublin. Yes, warfare affected Kilkenny. Yes, it suffered sieges, at least Cromwellian siege briefly, but it had none of the kind of destruction of many other places, so that neither the city itself nor the hinterland suffered the kind of losses and disruption that you can see even across in Tipperary in the in the late 16th and 17th century. So in that sense, the past is important because we kind of inherited wealth, but the relative level of continuity as well. Now, as I say, this is a point others have made much better than I'm making. I'm just saying it's certainly a factor in explaining 18th century Kilkenny. Second point that brings us into the century itself, the relative wealth of the city in our era, the era we're considering this evening. The survival here and hereabouts of what someone called sub-gentry families, so wealthy farming lineages surviving on old and new estates, a farming class that survived and thrived on wool and cereals production, even in hard times. And these networks were certainly, supporting business and spending their money in a place like Kilkenny. You've only got to look at the early volumes, early issues of the Finn's Leinster Journal, from the 1760s, to see the kind of range of goods and services that are not aimed at the rich, they're aimed at people who are well-to-do enough to be reading the paper. And that tells its own story. You don't find the same sense of a wealthy hinterland in certainly most other inland Irish towns. Now, again, a point I'm sure I don't have to labour. It's familiar. But the third argument is perhaps a little bit less emphasised, and I think it is, if not equally important, certainly important, and that is simply the fact that Dublin's growth, that I was talking about a few moments ago, Dublin's growth to become the second largest city in the English/British Empire by the early 1700s, had collateral effects. It's gone well ahead of Bristol, of Norwich, or of Glasgow, or Edinburgh, certainly well before the time the Drapier letters are appearing in 1720. So how was this big growing city of, well passing 100,000 by the early 18th century, how was it to be fed? Well, much of the grain, much of the corn came from nearby in Fingal, Kildare, and here from the county Kilkenny. Now, other sources important, Wexford, Lecale, and some across the water from the south of England. But the great corn market, which was built in the 1720s, there in the middle of Thomas Street, it's like a smaller version of the old library in Trinity College. That corn market would be very familiar to the carters coming up the road from these parts, from Kilkenny. And that takes you back to the beginning of the 18th century and brings, if you like, good incomes to the farmers at a time when farming went through some very bad periods in the early 18th century. But if we move just a little forward in time to the 1750s and beyond, you have the rise of wheat cultivation and the production of flour here in the county. The rise of flour milling on the Nore, the Kings River, and on the Barrow. This is actually, I'm using an 18th century image of a flour mill at Tullow, which I think is one of the earliest images we have of these multi-story mills. One of the very first, though, was by the Kilkenny man, William Collis, with a paddle wheel harnessing the flow of fast-moving but low-fall kind of major river. This is there's obviously a fall here, but the smaller mills on the side tributaries would tend to be of a different design, generally the oat mills, but these big flour mills or multi-story mills are using the water power to sift as well as to grind and to prepare a flour that could capture a good price in Dublin. Of course, this is very much linked up with the development of the canals as well. So another element in every big city was, well, keeping warm, getting an energy source. And certainly going back to the late 1600s, as Dublin began to grow, there was talk that there was great unknown riches on the hills of North Kilkenny and across the county border, and that really Kilkenny was going to heat Dublin. Others said, well, there's up there in the north, what about up in County Tyrone? Now, a lot of the talk about building canals in the 1710s, 2030s, all about getting coal supplies for Dublin. Now, coal was coming to Dublin from across the water, from Cumbria, from Whitehaven. And that indeed was very convenient because it was a coal that was extracted almost on the water's edge in the northwest of England. But the hope, for all sorts of reasons, was to have an Irish source, and the Irish Parliament supported the drive to make Kilkenny coal the coal for Dublin. But as you probably know, the Castlecomer coal and from parts of Dunan was, perhaps is, really an anthracite that could be used very much for processes like malting, but was not an easy burner in the domestic hearth. So it was a disappointment. But the point is, it still is a very important part of Dublin's 18th century history, the Kilkenny coal being brought on cart with Kilkenny corn and later Kilkenny flour by cart and by canal. And they kind of are part of this kind of wider sort of movement of goods up towards the capital city. In addition to that, though, Kilkenny really emerges as a kind of information junction. The word hub is a little bit overused these days, but for the south, the southeast, it was the natural place through which news passed. And as the economy became bigger and more complex and more commercialized, that mattered. So first of all, it was the postboys and the horses, then the stagecoaches, and then from 1789, the much faster moving mail coaches coming down from Dublin, and then, in a sense, changing coach and, of course, horse in Kilkenny as well as in other areas. So this becomes, if you like, a centre for inns, a centre for livery stables, for people looking for service. So this kind of role of Kilkenny as a place for folks in transit, as well as a place to linger, comes really strongly through. If you're looking at the evidence from the newspapers, of Finn's Leinster Journal, or looking at the directories, it's, I think, unique. I mean, you can't, if you look around Ireland, there's no other town, as you begin to get a coaching system, and you begin to get a more complex system of inland transport that has this kind of role. I mean, somebody's argued that Enniskillen perhaps said that a bit, but Enniskillen is a very small player compared to Kilkenny at that time. Now, I should of course add that a lot of stuff is moved around Ireland by coastal trade, not human traffic, but a lot of the bulk traffic, say between Dublin and Cork, isn't coming down here through Kilkenny. It's coming, of course, in the coastal movement. But in terms of road traffic, particularly with the turnpikes from the 1730s, Kilkenny is seeing an awful lot more business and to some extent seeing its own roads constantly under pressure, and a grand jury constantly complaining about having to spend more. But I think, the kind of the most eloquent sort of sign of what I've just been saying about the sort of hub role of Kilkenny comes from Finn's Leinster Journal. Now, it's not unique. It's not. I mean, there are newspapers starting up like Finn's twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week, in all of the 10 places that I've been looking at. There's, I think, I forget when the last one is, but they're all from the 30s, the 40s, 60s, 70s. But my point is that Finn's, first of all, it's very successful, it continues, it's well run, but you've only got to look at some of the early issues, and you see the kind of vibrancy of not just Kilkenny, but the kind of the region that it's serving and the kind of catchment area for the paper. That particular paper, just coincidence, this is from April 1782. This is just a moment before Henry Grattan makes his great speech, and when you get the what we call by shorthand the legislative independence, Grattan's Parliament, but it's more complex than that. But just that little first paragraph I want to read to you, if only because it's telling you something about the Kilkenny Corporation in one of its more liberal and expansive moments in the 18th century. We, the grand jury of the county of the city of Kilkenny, at spring assize of 1782, assembled conscious that every citizen who wishes to support the glorious cause of liberty should at this critical juncture declare his sentiments, and we have unanimously entered into the following resolutions. First, that the Kings, Lords and Commons of Ireland are the only power that have a right to make laws to bind Ireland, and that we will, the utmost of our power, resist the execution of any other laws. Resolved that members of the House of Commons are the representatives of the people, and that such members, etc., etc., etc. Now, I mean, there's nothing extraordinary about that sentiment at that moment, but there's really, I mean, first of all, it's rather stronger than you get at certain other city grand juries saying at that moment. It's a sign of something about the political makeup here of the corporation and the MPs in the county. But here it is on the front page of a 4-page journal. It's fresh, and you can be sure that that would have impact among, well, the hundreds of people who bought the paper and the thousands of people who either read it or had it read to them. So this is how politics is seeping out ultimately from Dublin through a paper like this. And Finn's was well run, and the widow, Catherine Finn, who was there for over 20 years after her husband's death in 1777, was a very effective entrepreneur, it would seem. Yet, compared to some, in fact, to almost all the growing port cities that I've been looking at, there are things that were missing here in Kilkenny. And I'll just talk about 3 quickly. 1, big merchants. 2, kind of property speculation, spatial remodeling, and thirdly, upper class residents. Now, sort of play around. So the first thing, merchants. Well, the great export-import merchants, be they ship owners or commission merchants, who dominated the life in the ports. If Protestant, they dominated the corporations in the city councils in the ports. If Catholic, they certainly are pushing there at the formation of things like chambers of commerce and so on. But I mean, where you have nearly 500 people describing themselves as merchants in the Dublin directories of the 1780s, you look at the first directory that covers Kilkenny in 1788, you find only, I think, 4 or 5. They're not here. I mean, the civic leaders are not people who are engaged in wholesale, long-distance trade. The civic leaders, I think, are doctors or physicians, lawyers, not the traders in High Street or down the lanes beside it. I mean, there is money, no question of that. There are capitalized people in business who are emerging. Not just William Collis and the marble works, but others who get involved in flour milling, who get involved in developing the woolen industry beyond its workshop state and build the first woolen mills, particularly just after 1800. But looking back from 1800, it's striking that there is, let's say, there are almost no Quaker families here, whereas they're so important in the development of big business in Waterford and play quite an important role in Cork and Limerick. Point we might sort of come back to, but it's telling us something about that kind of inland business. It was different. It was smaller scale. It required less capital. Then there's a question about the kind of urban speculation, urban remodeling, talking about the kind of physical space. I mean, the revolution in brick and the application of kind of classical ideas, neoclassical ideas to urban facades, which we see in Waterford, in Cork, in Limerick, and obviously in Dublin, is slow in coming here. Yes, we have some very fine examples just across the street and up on the parade, but Waterford, not very far away, is a very good example of development, say, there in the Mall, at a time when that simply isn't happening here. I mean, take the Tulsa, which that photograph from, I think it's about 1870. It's a lovely early image, certainly. But the thing is that, whether you're talking about the building itself or about the shops beside it, I mean, you're looking at probably a great mix of buildings where the skeletons were 16th century or 17th century or possibly 18th century. There's much more kind of recycling going on here than one would expect, than what one would generally find down in Waterford or certainly in Limerick. I mean, there's a kind of constant refurbishing of very solid older housing stock going on. And I mean, that's no bad thing. It's just telling us that Kilkenny is different. I mean, okay, you can say, well, we do have remodeling here with the building of the layout of the parade and the kind of forceful development there back in the old first Duke of Ormond's time. And John Bradley wrote a very interesting article, showing how Ormond kind of strong-armed the corporation to get back land in the Restoration period to sort of create the parade. And so that is remodeling. That is something new. But that's almost the only case that one can point to. I mean, there's relatively little kind of, let's say, riverside development you might expect. Not maybe with a fear of floods. A very good, very reasonable fear given what happened in 1763 and the very serious damage done, particularly in Irishtown. But it's also perhaps, there isn't a kind of fashionable speculative housing, because perhaps the demand wasn't here. I mean, there's no assembly rooms of the kind that you find in other cities. No there isn't that kind of demand for fashionable housing, perhaps, that you would find elsewhere. And I think what is quite telling here is the history of Kilkenny theatre. Now, as I'm sure everyone knows, there's a kind of golden age of Kilkenny private theatre in the early 1800s, but it's really going back a little bit before that. I mean, yes, there is a seasonal theatre in the old courthouse, occasionally in the Dolcel, for weeks around the two assizes, kind of high points when folks with money came to town. And there is the attempt in 1784 and the more successful attempt in 1794-5, I think it is, to have a new kind of purpose-built theatre in the parade, and a short and disastrous 2 seasons of that theatre in with Robert Owenson in 95 and 96. And it's not really until after the Union that you begin to see kind of social or commercial success for theatre. So my point is simply this: there are other places that are smaller than Kilkenny that have a rather livelier theatre history in the 18th century. I mean, a place like Derry has a more lively theatre history in the 18th century. So is it that Kilkenny was too close to Dublin? Or is it the absence of moneyed patrons here who would have supported theatre? Or is it just, that there was about enough space when the old courthouse was kitted out? I'm not sure, but it's sort of quite suggestive. Now, staying with this sort of issue of the kind of non-appearance of certain kind of 18th century things in the city. I mean, the most distinctive classical architecture in Kilkenny, it seems to me at least, is related to, state or Protestant institutions. I mean, the Bishop's House, the Kilkenny College, the new courthouse, and so on. The kind of the big merchants, or the families who had money and are associated at the time, are certainly not associated with the kind of big developments that you see in a place, say, like contemporary Belfast. And I just want to say a word or two about the courthouse across the street. I mean, the courthouse that now stands goes back to the 1790s, as I think everyone knows, even though heavily modified in the 1820s, and then I think it had 2 fires in the 20th century. Anyway, the point is, but the original building, it's often commented on in the literature, has strong kind of links to the courthouse that was in Waterford, which was from 1784, this one being, I think it's 1792 or thereabouts. Now, what is very interesting to me, at least, is how come you get what seems to be the influence of Gandon, the great hero of Dublin 18th century architecture, influencing what happens here. Because if this is like Waterford, Waterford we know was designed by Gandon. It was demolished in the 1850s, but we know from images and drawings that it was a very fine part of Gandon's inventory of work. And the influence is here. And I was always puzzled. And then suddenly it just occurred to me that, of course, the Protestant, the Church of Ireland bishop here in Kilkenny, in Ossory, between, I think it's 82 and 94, in other words, the period leading up to the commissioning of the courthouse here, was Bishop William Beresford, who, brother of the John Beresford, who, of course, was Gandon's patron. So I think certainly it's, to me, there's an even more interesting untold story about how Gandon was brought into having an influence, at least on one Kilkenny building. There is no obvious equivalent to that extraordinary architect in Waterford, John Roberts, the man associated with Waterford Church of Ireland Cathedral and the Waterford Catholic Cathedral, the man who really seems to have built everything worth commenting on in late 18th century Waterford, slight exaggeration. But Roberts, it's an extraordinary story of a homegrown success who is applying, in some cases, very advanced ideas and in some cases rather archaic ideas in public building. Is there a Kilkenny architect somewhere there? Well, I suppose I would like to know a bit more about George Smith, because Smith is, of course, the man we know was responsible for the two bridges, for Green Bridge and John's Bridge, as well as other bridges down the Nore and possibly other work. We know, at least we're told, that Smith was a pupil of George Semple, key figure at the beginning of the White Street Commissioners in Dublin in the 1750s. George Smith, however, dies sometime in the 1770s. I don't know much more about him than that, but the quality of the two city bridges is the one that survives and the one that doesn't, is really very impressive indeed. If one was hunting around, I suppose, for homegrown architectural sophistication, I think I would start with trying to find out a bit more about Mr. George Smith. Now, I'm coming near the end, but I want to just make a short diversion to try and situate Kilkenny in the wider Irish story by comparing it for a few minutes with the other second city of the province of Leinster, Drogheda. Now, you may quickly say, it is not a city. Well, indeed it isn't, although there has been quite a strong lobby to try and get it made a city. And in terms of the kind of criterion that I've used, it's in the league of cities. Now, let's not worry about that. But let's just take it that's roughly of the same order of magnitude as Kilkenny. And let's just compare the two for a few minutes. Well, Drogheda had certainly some obvious differences. It's nearer to Dublin. It's a port, nearer to Dublin. It's a somewhat less wealthy hinterland, especially if you're looking northwards into North Meath or County Louth. It had horrific traumas in the 17th century, not least, of course, with Cromwell. But there are parallels, interesting parallels. Both Drogheda, Kilkenny, great medieval towns, both times medieval parliaments were held. They're both strongly defended, twin towns divided by a river. Each had a kind of cluster of Old English families, of tribes that remained Catholic and were dispersed, but not destroyed in the events of the 1650s. Both went on to become supply points for Dublin, for foodstuffs. Both very important in flour milling, as I've been saying. Both had a rather kind of white elephant canal story. Here, certainly a white elephant, but the Boyne navigation never lived up to its reputation and for all the money that was spent on it. Both Drogheda and Kilkenny had strong kind of old-style industrial history. I've said very little about Kilkenny's woolen workshops, mainly in Irishtown, like Drogheda's linen industry, which was there outside, as far as we can see, outside the walls, west of the town on the north side of the Boyne. Very strong artisanal traditions in each case. Drogheda was both involved in linen manufacture, but also a great hub for the great mart for the export of linen yarn across to Lancashire, a story that goes right back to Elizabethan times, if not earlier. In both places, they had, if you like, very important patrons. Here, of course, the Ormond clan until the second Duke's disgrace and departure, etc., after 1715. And the large, but not complete, kind of divide of the Ormond estates, the loss of, if you like, the Ormond family as big spenders here in and around Kilkenny. In the case of Drogheda, it wasn't one big magnate, it was the fact that the Archdiocese of Armagh, both Catholic and Protestant, stretched right down to the Boyne, and that archbishops, certainly in the established church, resided in Drogheda. In the 17th century, famous Archbishop Usher, for instance, built in Drogheda, and there were Archbishop residents in Drogheda until the 1750s, until, in a sense, they remembered that there was a place called Armagh that they could also live in. Now that's pretty about it, but you certainly had strong patronage from archbishops and from others in Drogheda, which is kind of fading out of the picture by certainly the middle of the 18th century. In each case, though, linked to that, you have kind of prestige Protestant schools. I mean, Kilkenny College, Drogheda Grammar School really stand out in the country as a place to which people with money who wanted to educate their children in a kind of classical academy before going on to college would think about those two places. And that brought business because people stayed with their sons or visitors or whatever. So, it's another little kind of nucleus of activity in the two places. Both, as we move a little later in time, both places had kind of politically powerful patrons in the mid and late 18th century. Here, I'm thinking about the Ponsonby family. Even though they're living down the far south of the county, they are, if you like, they're powerful in national terms, on and off, and they, in their own way, try to look after Kilkenny. And it's thanks to the Ponsonby that the parliamentary money came so quickly to build the new bridges after the 1763 flood. And, that something between 5,000 and 6,000, I'm going on memory here, it comes in subvention, which is huge at that time. It's not the city, it's not the urban ratepayers who pay for those bridges, it's the state. And that would not have happened with the responsiveness of a powerful patron with local interests, i.e. John and other members of the Ponsonby family. So that, I think, is important. And that continues, albeit not perhaps so powerful, late in the century. In the case of Drogheda, you have the man who's famous as the Speaker of the Irish Parliament in Grattan's era, John Foster, man based at Cullen near Drogheda, but who very much regards Drogheda as his place. Now, perhaps it wasn't, but he certainly is responsible for bringing some parliamentary monies into the town and for trying to improve its rather awful access to the sea. Now, when we look at the two centres in the late 18th century, a new kind of difference is evident. I think about 1890 in that one, but it's simply just to bring out the kind of the very striking classical features that perhaps I think are still more or less visible, are they not? But anyway, the point is when we come into the late 18th century, a new kind of difference is evident between Drogheda and Kilkenny. Kilkenny, more heavily Catholic and relatively insulated from the kind of growing turbulence of Irish politics than the case of Drogheda. And this is just, again, back to the table you probably can't see, but it's just, again, trying to get a sense of the proportion Catholic in Irish cities in 1660, and this is just taking figures from the late 18th century. I have also didn't fit in figures from the 1830s, but it's really showing the case of the Kilkenny figure missing, but essentially Kilkenny back in the 1660s certainly is showing the highest proportion of Catholic, and in all the later figures, right through the 1830s, that's true as well. In the case of Drogheda, that's markedly less evident. But the point, I suppose, is really when we look at what's happening in these two places in the 1780s and 1790s, there's some really striking differences. Here in Kilkenny, you have a kind of reformist support from the powers that be for certainly for Catholic relief, if not for parliamentary reform. Now that wasn't true, admittedly, when up in the Bishop's House you had a Beresford from 1782 to 1794, but once he's replaced by Bishop Thomas O'Byrne, comes in 1795 for 3 years. O'Byrne, who himself is of Catholic background and is very well connected to Liberal and Whig figures in England, is certainly very supportive of Catholic relief and opposed to the kind of the Beresford view of the state of Ireland. And then you have, of course, the return of the Butlers, so to speak, to the castle. And you have, in the case of Walter Butler, again, somebody who's conformist, and politically, both in the castle and in the Bishop's House, in a sense, support in very turbulent times for a kind of pacific, softly approach. Now, it doesn't mean there wasn't excitement here during the 90s. I mean, certainly within kind of middle-class Catholic Kilkenny, there's a very strong division of opinion that spills out into the newspapers as to how Catholic relief is to be advanced in the early 1790s. There's a real split in the town. But that isn't sectarian. It's just simply, in a sense, I think, younger and newer people challenging the slightly more timid, softly approach of their older and more senior neighbours. Now, Drogheda, by comparison, was much more affected by the troubles of the 1790s, affected by rural sectarianism in South Ulster. It becomes a kind of refuge for the defenders, who are, in a sense, those who are, if you like, taking the hammer from the new Orange Order. And in a sense, you find some of the leading figures in Drogheda are accused by government, particularly by Foster, of being, if you like, the puppet masters behind a lot of the kind of rural troubles in the borderlands of Ulster and Leinster, which is almost certainly untrue, but it meant that there's a kind of very nasty sectarian taste to everything in Drogheda. So much so that the same man who tries to start theatre here on the parade, Robert Owenson, in 1795, he tried to start a theatre in Drogheda in 1794. I'm not quite sure where he was going to manage, but the mayor said theatre would be dangerous. The town is too disturbed. So Owenson set up his stage, but then the local, it wasn't the militia, but it was a kind of a posse associated with the corporation, bar access to the assembly room where the theatre was going to be held. It's a strange little incident, but it's, I think, quite telling. Well, when we come, and I just say a brief word about 1798. I mean, the thing, of course, we all know is that Kilkenny City was not by any means drawn into the conflict. There is some evidence in the workshop world of Irish town of links with United Irish activity in Carlow and in Dublin. And I think there the woolen trade is kind of important because so many figures that we know of, national figures, who are involved in the lead up to 98 were, in terms of their business, involved in the woolen trade. So it'd be really odd if, in fact, that didn't have some bearing on things here in Kilkenny. But there isn't a huge amount of evidence. There's just little bits. Back in the Kilkenny County History volume, Louis Cullen, I think, brings together almost as much as we have in terms of hard evidence coming up to the castle about what was happening here. But in a sense, the town was not, the middle and upper classes of Kilkenny were not divided, were not sort of at each other's throat in the way that was the case in certain other counties and areas of the country. So whatever was happening one stage down in the world of the workshop couldn't, in a sense, get much traction. Now, just a little footnote to that. There's a lovely little publication came out some years ago of a Belfast United Irishman, Andrew Bryson, who is ultimately sentenced to transportation. It goes to Caribbean and is marched down with various other prisoners through the country from the north down through, among other places, Kilkenny. And he reports in a letter back to his sister, written from America, or from the Caribbean, about how when he was in Kilkenny, he talked, I think it was to the wife or the daughter of a tavern keeper, and how she assures him, everybody here, of course, supported the knighted men. Everybody here. Now, unfortunately, that may be late night chat, but one should be careful about, in a sense, completely assuming that all was sweet and swimming here when so much horror was happening across the hills in Wexford, and even, of course, up at Castle Comer. So what I thought in a sort of gloomy way I would use as my last slide is really a banknote, which is the Loughnane's short-lived bank, the Kilkenny Bank, is 1818. And as you probably know, it was one of, I think, two Kilkenny banks which had a very short life. In this case, it went down in 1820. But 1820 was actually, in very real sense, the end of the story that I've been trying to tell this evening, because so many of the factors that have been leading to growth in terms of population and up to a point in terms of living standards, at least for those who had a skill and those above that, is kind of coming into a much more difficult era after the Napoleonic Wars. I'm not painting it simply black and white, but certainly you've got a sense of a really different environment when you're looking at individual towns or you're looking at a place like Kilkenny in the 20s and 30s. It's, yes, politically things are opening up and it's a more literate, there's a more kind of, education is much broader. So in many senses there are strong pluses, but in terms of the kind of commercial side of things that's ultimately determining living standards, these are hard times for most. And Kilkenny really, until the era of the railway, until 1850 and after, is a place that was no longer growing in population. And when visitors come across the bridge into Irish Town and visit Kilkenny, they don't talk in that era about how pleasant it is, how quaint it is, the lovely old character of the town. They are just struck by the poverty, particularly on the edges of the city. And that is very much a kind of a pre-famine story, about which I can say nothing more. Thank you.